Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Geoff Hurd. I'm from Phytogreen. I'm going to be chairing this session. There's some normal start of session housekeeping, so it's thank you to all the sponsors and exhibitors. Without these guys, these things don't happen. Delegates, please make sure you're wearing your badges, but we're near the end of the session, well, the conference, so I'm sure you are. Please make sure your phones are turned to silent. And I'd like to introduce Dr. Tan. He's an associate professor in the Department of Architecture in the School of Design and Environment of the National University of Singapore. Dr. Tan is going to be speaking on Singapore moving towards a vertical garden city. Please welcome Dr. Tan.
Thank you, Geoff, for the introduction. Very good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'd also like to thank Matt Dillon, if he's in the room, or at least the Green Roof Australasia for the invitation for me to speak here today. I'm going to talk about a topic that is close to my heart. It's something that I've been working on for perhaps 20 years now. Firstly, as a public servant, overseeing the research and the promotion activities for high-rise greening in Singapore for many years, and more recently as a member of the academia, but still very much involved in activities looking into the greening of Singapore and other cities. Now, Singapore has for many years been pursuing a very active urban greening policy and program. And the outcome is what we see today, what Singapore is known as a garden city. And over the last 10 to 15 years, Singapore has also begun to promote for the high-rise greening of its environment, meaning pushing green onto buildings, and so that it could eventually take the form of a vertical garden city. Now, obviously, at the moment, a vertical garden city is just a metaphor, but I guess good ideas always start off with a vision, and I hope this could be a start of a vision to make Singapore truly and literally a vertical garden city. Now, why a vertical garden city? The slides on the screen perhaps illustrate this pretty well. This is one of my favorite green spaces in Singapore. Very popular, very well used by the public for a range of purposes, from having just a gathering, a picnic, a family outing, kite flying is a very popular kite flying spot in Singapore, and also having a spot where you have a fantastic view of the ever-changing skyline of Singapore's CBD. Now, this is actually a green roof. This is a green roof on top of a key infrastructure facility for Singapore. It houses several very large palms that controls the water between this spot, which is a freshwater reservoir, and the sea. So it's a public infrastructure, and a key one for that matter, because it's so meant to control flooding in the upper stream of the catchment. Now, when the story goes that when the engineers who decided to have to design the house, the building that housed the palms, they came up with a very utilitarian design for the palms, and thankfully the proposal was thrown out, rejected, and they had to commission a new design. And I was very fortunate to be involved in the earlier consultation for this project. And what you have here now today is not just a roof that is green. It could have been a roof that is just bare and underutilized, but it's now not just a green roof. It is also a roof that is serving the green open space requirement of Singapore. So the idea that a same piece of land with multi-layered functions is one of the key factors why Singapore is pushing for greening of its high-rise environment, simply because of the kind of space constraint that we face as a country. Right, so what I'm going to talk about next is to share a few more motivating factors why Singapore is pushing for the greening of the city. I'll next talk about some examples of what I think are good examples of high-rise greening in Singapore. And lastly, I will share some perspectives of what I think the future could hold for high-rise greening in Singapore. Now, Singapore to me is unusually green. Now, I say it's unusually green because Singapore, as you know, has a very tiny landmass, but has a very high population. Current population is 5.5 million. In fact, we're talking about a population of 6.9 million by 2030, and some even suggest that we could hit 10 million by 2050. It's a huge increase in population. Now, simply because of the population, we have a very high built density, but yet, as this image will show, you still have large tracts of green open spaces that are left behind, waiting for future development, but also green spaces are nested within the built-up areas of Singapore. This is one example of a public residential township in Singapore, and you can see that it's built right next to the nature reserve, which also serves as a water catchment with freshwater reservoirs. Parks are planned as part of the planning for new towns, but inserted, and within the built-up areas, you see pockets of green spaces that are preserved for open recreation needs. Now, the other pervasive feature of Singapore is the roadside planting. We do see that most of the roads, in fact, we estimated that more than 95% of all roads are planted with trees, one way or another, large and small. This is an example, and it's a very effective way of making sure that the green ambience is pervasive, because roads are everywhere in Singapore. Therefore, if you green up your roads, you tend to get a very green atmosphere within the city. Now, this has been going on for 50 years. In fact, last year, we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the first tree planting day that really kick-started the movement, and it was an initiative of the former Prime Minister. In fact, we can say that he's the chief architect of the greening of Singapore. Right, I sort of broke down the 50-year history into 3 key phases. 60s to 70s was a period of rapid greening. It doesn't matter whether we are using exotics or native, anything that grows will be tried and tested. And so that was the main focus, to green up rapidly urbanizing regions of Singapore with plants. The second phase was from 80s to 90s, where the focus now began to be a bit more about consolidation of operations, optimizing operations, and also differentiating the kind of landscapes that we have by having, for instance, different themes to parks that are created, introducing flowering plants, fruit trees, and plants with fragrance. Now, as we move into the 2000s, and with the growing awareness of sustainability issues, livability issues, there were more considerations now given to the way that Singapore develops its green, by looking more on ecological considerations. Now, it was also during this period that the idea that Singapore should begin to actively bring its greenery into the high-rise environment took shape and was started perhaps in the early 2000s. Now, why are we pushing for high-rise greening? I mentioned one reason, which is the multifunctional concept of spaces. That is one of the motivating factors. To me, I think the current and most important factor here is really high-rise greening is a means of replacing loss of green spaces. Michael from Singapore shared the good news that the green cover increased from 36 to 47% between 1986 and year 2007, and the politicians were leveraging on this to promote Singapore. There was a lot of euphoria, but the latest figure here is that the green cover has dropped to 40%. 2012, this is an official number. And our work, my own work in university suggests that by 2014, it has fallen below 40%. Now, for a small country to have lost about 7% of green cover, that's a tremendous amount of green space that we have lost. And therefore, it is important to look at different ways and conquering different kinds of surfaces in the city as a means of recovering the lost green spaces. So this is, to me, a key reason why we're promoting this very actively. Now, I mentioned about the need to overlay different functions on a roof. This is a picture I took from Osaka. It's probably similar to many cities. Osaka is a mega city, but you still can see one example, if you can see, one example of a green roof on top of one buildings, but many buildings still have very bare rooftops. It's the same in Singapore, and perhaps the same in many large cities worldwide. So there are a lot of spaces that we can use, and in fact, I think I remember that Stephen Peck wrote many years ago that the rooftop is the last urban frontier. So that's a space that is underutilized, and there's a lot of focus on how we can use it more effectively. The other reason why we're pushing for high-rise greening is really an indirect benefit of green. It delivers, we know generally it delivers a suite of ecosystem services, but I tend to call that as landscape services. So it is useful to improve the environment and contribute to human well-being, both physiologically and psychologically. And this is a prominent and an important objective of complementing what we have on the ground to use green spaces as a medium to improve the environment and improve human well-being. Now, the last reason which is important for Singapore here is really that we are trying to correct past mistakes. Singapore, before it was founded as a British colony, used to be covered almost 100% with primary rainforests. and thanks to the mismanagement of our colonial masters, within 100 years from founding of Singapore, we have lost more than 90% of its primary forests. And by now, Singapore has only about 0.3% of its primary forest that's left intact. And obviously, with that tremendous amount of loss of primary forests, we had a great extinction of biodiversity within Singapore. It is catastrophic extinction. And here, the issue now we're trying to save or safeguard here is really to conserve what we have by safeguarding the nature reserve, because that's still a rich source of biodiversity. But the city and the built-up area, and I listened to a presentation on biodiversity conservation or enhancement with green roofs in the earlier session. So the city is also looked upon as a space where we can introduce habitats to conserve and to enhance biodiversity for the whole city. And this is a very strong factor that is going on for Singapore at the moment. Right, so the motivating factors, I have presented them individually, but they are obviously interlinked. And if we scan the range of driving factors or drivers that push green roof and green wall movement worldwide, they are largely the same. The priority of importance given to factors may be different, but I think the suite of factors are generally well understood. Right, so in short, greening Singapore upwards in a high-rise environment is really a means to help to achieve the national objectives of urban sustainability and livability. Now, how do we do it? A range of policies and incentives have been put in place. It's both a carrot and a stick approach. Michael spoke about it yesterday, same as Faisal. We also, in the initial years of pushing for this, had to conduct a range of research to look at how we can contextualize benefits to Singapore's conditions, and also to overcome some of the technical barriers to implementation. Now, the other way is outreach and awareness. Those of you who heard Patrick Blong's presentation will probably agree with me that he talks with conviction and passion, and it's very useful to have a person like him to influence politicians. Right, so we invited him, for instance, to speak in Singapore in 2011. And quite immediately after that, almost literally, he was hijacked by largest property developer in Singapore. And that's how he got his first commission project that Michael talked about yesterday. Right, so it's useful to bring people who are able to inspire and influence, to get to influence politicians. Now, the other way is that we have to document and reach out to a larger group of audience and not just people who attend conference with publications. So during my time in government service, we produced a range of publications looking at, for instance, describing benefits, describing systems, and in more recent years, talking about guidelines to guide implementation. This is the latest publication. I was happy to be able to work on a book, which was published last year. And it happened because I felt that, having observed the movement in Singapore for more than 10 years, we probably have enough materials to write and document, and that was the idea for the book. So what I'm going to do next is to extract examples from the book to illustrate what are the kind of examples of high-rise greenery installations in Singapore. Right, I have tried very hard to avoid what was shown by the two earlier presentations. Right, and to some of you, I think this could be the third presentation of Singapore they have heard in the conference today, and I hope that this is not an overdose and you won't get fatigued listening to things about Singapore. Yeah. Now, what is high-rise greening, or in Singapore we call it as sky-rise greening? It is actually a unique term, but Hong Kong copied it and they start to use sky-rise greening. This word, the term sky-rise greening, originated in 1992 when we first held the first exhibition to demonstrate greening of the high-rise environment. But anyway, high-rise greening in our term refers to green walls, sky terraces that are inserted in intermediate floors within building, planter boxes, balconies, and of course the rooftops. That's what I mean by high-rise greening. So I'll show some examples. This is an example that I talk about. 15,000 square meters is large, implemented in 2008. Fantastic public open space. You can see the ramp that leads up to the top of the roof. So it's a very attractive place. And the palms that I talk about are housed within this facility. Right? Now, this is another iconic project in Singapore, and I was also glad to have been involved in the initial consultation. This is the School of Arts, Design, and Media in one of our universities. The shape is fascinating. And when we were talking about this project, there were a lot of naysayers. There were a lot of resistance, as you would expect. And the reason given for, or the main reason for the resistance was that this is pitch roof. The engineers were terrified that with the kind of torrential downpour we have in Singapore, the slope will fail. We pushed through, and I'm very glad that almost 10 years, in fact, it's coming to 10 years, and in 2 years' time, nothing has happened. It's still a roof, green roof, performing pretty well, and students can walk up the roof to their classrooms. Yeah. This is quite an early example of a rooftop garden in Singapore. This is Shaw House, implemented more than 20 years ago. This is an early picture, probably taken in late 1990s. The forest that is on top of the roof is surviving pretty well, and you would be amazed to see a sort of elevated forest, or urban forest, in one of the most busy shopping districts in Singapore. Now, this is turning out to be an icon of Singapore that some people like and dislike, depending on your preference. Something that I dislike, but anyway, has been turning out to be an icon of Singapore. And it probably still holds the record of having the highest rooftop garden in Singapore. This is Marina Bay Integrated Resorts. That's just a fanciful name to hide the fact that it's truly a casino. Was opened in 2011, and it has a great infinity pool, which allows you a very expansive view of the city skyline. It's a fantastic experience if you want to go up there. But of course, you have to pay to go up and use the facility. Right? And the plants are growing well. I'm in the vicinity I live in the vicinity, not on the building. And I go to the region to jog, and I have been observing the plants on top of the roof. It's doing very well. Yeah. Now, this is also a very interesting project for the Subaru drive-through Subaru showroom. As you know, Subaru produces all-wheel drive and SUVs. Now, why do Singaporeans want to drive SUV and all-wheel drive in a kind of urban condition escapes me. But the fact that if you want to buy a SUV and all-wheel drive, you need an off-track condition to test the capability of the cars. You can't get that kind of conditions easily in Singapore, right? So this is done on the roof, right? It's a fantastic idea, but you have to be sure of your driving skills so that you don't end up in the canal over here. Yeah, so it's a fantastic idea, and I think it's still doing very well. Yeah. Now, one of the major targets for promoting high-rise greening is our housing authority, our public housing authority. Because of the kind of small land mass that we have, Singaporeans live in high-rise apartments like this. This is public housing. 83% of Singaporeans live in public housing like this. And the Housing Authority, or HDB, has in recent years been very proactive in implementing high-rise greening. This is an example of a rooftop garden that is built above a multi-story car park, and it's a very common typology for housing design. Another example, this is the multi-story car park. And you can see that after a number of years, this is probably 8 years, you can establish a very large vegetation on a rooftop garden, which is also a functional public space. Yeah. Now, the other kind of high-rise greening is sky terraces. I think this is quite special to Singapore because I don't see it in many cities. And this is really having spaces that are carved out at different heights in the building, and you put in the vegetation as a space for building occupants to use. This is quite a good idea because at lunchtime, it is hot and sweaty in Singapore. The rooftop garden is not a space that we want to use. So somewhat sheltered environment is much better, and this is proliferating in Singapore now at the moment. Okay, example of what it looks like. Unfortunately, I think some spaces have turned into a secret smoking corner, which is, yeah. Now, there are also nowadays more and more developments that are inserting green spaces at multiple tiers within the building or within the development. This is Kotek Port Hospital, our latest hospital. And it was driven by a CEO of the hospital who is very passionate about green and who believes that green has certain restorative effects on patients. So he was insistent that the hospital must be green. In fact, if you look at this image, you may not even be able to tell that it's a hospital. It looks like a hotel. And he has also made sure that he has allocated some space for community garden for the residents to use, residents who are staying within the vicinity to use. So it's a fantastic place. Now, this is another form of sky terrace implementation in Singapore. This is a building by Ken Young, the eco-architect. Now, Ken Young has this fascination with green that connects the ground to the roof. So in this particular building, he designed sky terraces that runs from the bottom of the building and which spirals up the building all the way to a green rooftop garden. That's his design concept. This is an image of what a terrace looks like. Okay, another image of the spiral that's going up. Unfortunately, it wasn't designed to be accessible, so it's somewhat decorative. He was touted to have good biodiversity value, but I haven't seen any kind of data coming out from the building. And when it was completed, it was touted as the greenest building in Singapore way back in 2011, I think, 2010. It was beaten by this next building, which is Park Royal on Pickering Street. Fascinating building, designed by a local architecture firm called Woha. You can see the sky terraces that are creatively and cleverly inserted at different tiers, so that this is a hotel, and occupants who are, or rather the clients or customers, can have a fantastic view of greenery looking out of the window. Right. Michael talked about 158 Cecil Street, which is the internal green wall, and I like to show this example because this was what the atrium looked like, pretty unattractive, and I was told that tenants who were occupying the space over here disliked the space so much, and therefore rental yield was pretty low. In fact, this is an undesirable spot in the building to have. But once the green has been put in, it becomes a very desirable place, and the building owner could recoup a lot of his investments from just tenants who are facing the green atrium. So it's a good example of how, if you implement green in a strategic fashion, you can have some business returns. And apparently, as well, Facebook has an operation in Singapore. So the co-founder of Facebook, I can't remember his name. There are a lot of rich and famous celebrities in Singapore now. He liked it so much, so he commissioned the landscape contractor to do a similar wall on top of his office right at the top of the building. Yeah. I like to show this because this is perhaps a milestone of a high-rise greening implementation in Singapore. So it was implemented way back in 2007. Perhaps the first project, high-rise project in Singapore to demonstrate that it is possible to have a green continuous wall that runs from the bottom to the top of the building, and that's probably 100 meters tall. Right? And you can see that there are also sky terraces that are inserted at different levels for the use of the residents. Right? This is a good example of that. Now, Patrick Blanc talked about this green wall in Gardens by the Bay, which is housed within a conservatory, and it was meant to mimic a montane forest. I inserted this slide to show you what he was referring to. So this is totally man-made. It's artificial. There's a form of scaffolding, and on top of scaffolding, there's a vertical green wall system that has been implemented. It's fascinating. This is another view of it. It's a very large installation. I will skip this slide. Just perhaps to point out that for those of you who have a chance to visit Gardens by the Bay, if you're walking on top of this area, which is called the World of Plants, it's actually a rooftop garden, huge deck that's built on top of some F&B's facilities below. Something that's not so common are sky bridges, which are landscape. This is a project by Daniel Lebanskin. You can see some trees are planted on it over here, as well as some planting on top of the building. It's not so common. Perhaps the only other good example is this pinnacle, which is public housing. Very dense, and there are 2 tiers of sky bridges that links the different blocks together. And if you're a resident staying there, you can actually jog around the whole circuit without having to get to the floor, which is also polluted because of vehicle exhaust. Now, I've gone through very quickly some of the examples of installations in Singapore, and I'll next share with you some perspectives of what I think the future could hold for the movement in Singapore going forward. To me, I think we're going to see more iconic structures and buildings. There's a period in Singapore's building history where architects were very attracted by the clean and modern look of glass facades and glass curtain walls, which is very inappropriate for Singapore's tropical climate because of the kind of energy inefficiency, despite the advent of different kind of cladding materials. And now I think we are beginning to see a greater effort to integrate green or greenery onto buildings as part of tropical architecture, which I think is more climate sensitive. So there's a movement going on now, and this is one example that is of a building under construction, Capital Green, with green planters and balconies, and also sky terraces that are inserted in different floors. This is designed by Japanese architect Toyo Ito. In fact, Toyo Ito said this is the office of the future one big tree. And I think his quote is perhaps more suitable for this building, again designed by our local architecture firm Woha. It's fascinating. I am not sure how the landscape contractor, who is also here in the conference, I have not seen him today, is going to implement this, but I think it's fascinating to see what the outcome will be like. Right? And you can see the building that's being constructed over here. Sky Habitat by Moshi Safdi, who also designed the Sky Park in Marina Bay Sands. The idea here was that Singaporeans, because they're living in a high-rise environment, there is in fact very little space that you can have for gardening, very much like unlike Australia, or for that matter, in UK. Right? So the idea here was that the design should provide as much sky terraces as possible for residents to have some form of gardening activities. Obviously, it's a high-end residential development, and you can see a perspective of what the Sky Bridge would be like. Another hospital that's coming up, perhaps to be completed and commissioned within the next 6 months, is the Ng Teng Fong Hospital. Again, the idea that green is important for the recuperative function has been gaining acceptance in our hospital industry. And the CEO here wanted to make sure that every patient in the hospital would have a view of greenery when he looks out the window. Right? So this was done by inserting lots of terraces in the opening of windows, where the windows are. I think that there's some design functions to use the green to mitigate glare. So the green is also a shading device for the building. Now, the second main trend that I think is going to happen here is that instead of having buildings, isolated buildings with perhaps some wonderful examples of high-rise greening implementation, the movement now is going to a district-based kind of approach where the master developer implements some urban design parameters where it requires buildings in the district to have high-rise greening. So this is one example that has been implemented, perhaps the only one in Singapore, at the Changi Business Park, where almost every building that you see in this picture here has either rooftop garden, sky terraces, green walls within the building. So I think this is going to be a trend where we're going to take a district-based approach, and this aligns with the kind of national land use planning that's taking place in Singapore, for instance, in our Master Plan 2014. Now, the third thing that I see happening is that we're going to have more failures. In Singapore, it's trendy to be green. And in fact, if you are a developer and if you're developing a residential complex, if you do not show enough green on your brochures and perspective, your property may not sell very well. And to me, has gone to a level where it is almost fetish. And what are the consequences? So you see examples of buildings like this now in Singapore where I truly do not know what this is or meant to represent. There are some planter boxes, and this is a high-rise apartment in the university where I work for, and creepers are planted. It's still a mono species, so the creepers are planted. It's meant to creep out some mesh walls. But the positioning of the screen is perhaps not thought through very carefully. It doesn't have a thermal insulation function because it's not shielding any part of the building that gets the western sun. It doesn't look very nice. Now I put it as semi-decorative, but it has very little function. And why it has been approved and why it's done escapes me. But this is, I think, one example of a design that's not meant to be repeated. We also have fairly impressive installation like this, where you can see a green strip running up the whole building. This is fairly a large installation. But again, I really question the function of such an installation. It costs money to do this. The green actually shields and cover open ventilated stairwell, which is an emergency staircase for the building. It doesn't have any shading function because it's open ventilated. Nobody is staying within that space. So the energy conservation function is very minimal or non-existent. In fact, I think it compromises daylighting within the stairwell because now we probably have to turn on the lights, right, within the stairwell to achieve the performance requirement. Right, this is another example, and I think this is classic. I think this is probably a good example of illustrating how to grow bonsais on roof. It's definitely not decorative, and there's no function I can see, and I'm not sure whether Stephen is in the room. I think the person who designed this, as well as the person who approved this, should be sent to Stephen's Green Roof 101 course. But that's happening, so no, and it's just hilarious to see this. This is very high-end, prestigious development in Singapore. You can see this green wall is black because the plants are dead. High-end is a 6-star residential development within the shopping district of Singapore, but has failed. Right? Obviously, for high-end development, you can't allow a failed green wall to be there for a long time. So you can imagine that there will be repeated planting, repeated rectification to get the system correct. But these are costs. They are costs not just to developers, they are costs also to us in terms of material use. Another example of failure, and in fact, this is in public housing. Plants have died, and if you can see over here, the irrigation system has not been installed correctly, and the floor is wet, it becomes a safety hazard. And these are expensive, mistakes to correct. Examples of other kind of failures that we see in Singapore. In fact, I would not think that this system is maintainable. Once the plants have died, you just have to replant, let them grow up again. It probably takes half a year. In Singapore, everything grows very quickly, but you still have to go through the effort of replanting, and there's no access from the back to maintain the green screen. This is an example within the university. Again, it is very ugly when plants are dead. Right? So there are expensive failures that have been happening in Singapore. Failure because of poor choice of design. In Singapore, it's definitely no to use an organic matter as a screen to retain growing media because the organic matter will rot very quickly in our tropical environment. Right? It's a poor choice of material, and it's very expensive to fix. And this is where there's meant to be horticulture excellence, is in the Singapore Botanic Gardens. Right, so this is my last slide. I would like to summarize. One of the things I've been observing and advocating here is that we need to be conscious that all forms of greenery requires resources to install and maintain. Right? Because of material use, there's an ecological footprint to materials that are being used. All the materials that are used for green walls, even for recyclable materials, you need energy to produce them. So there's also a carbon footprint and an energy footprint. If we want to push for high-rise greening of whatever forms, beauty, therefore, cannot be the main objective for installation. Okay. Obviously, I'm not saying that beauty is not important because I offend a lot of designers among the audience and also my colleagues who design. But beauty alone doesn't bring out more functions unless the design has been thought through very carefully. Right? And the approach that I am suggesting is therefore to take a broader perspective of ecological design. And when we talk about ecology, I'm using it in the perspective of what is known as urban ecology. And when you're designing for a green wall, you should take into account not just about biodiversity, but also the kind of invisible flows of materials and energy that happens within our environment, and integrate that so that your green wall and green roof becomes a bioengineering solution to complement traditional engineering solutions. So one example, for instance, is to install green walls that, in addition to providing the green benefits, also integrate the water cycle within the building so that it can clean the water that is, for instance, coming out from the toilets, use the phytoremediative properties of systems to treat the water, recycle it, and reuse it for irrigation. It is already developed in many cities, but in Singapore, we're still far behind in terms of the system integration. Julian showed the example of using plants within a sort of greenhouse condition on top of a roof to treat exhaust from buildings that is contributing to the air pollution in Madrid or Spain. That's another example of using systems that integrated to deliver more than one function. So Really, it is about beauty with function or form with function, and not form with function, or with example that show something that has no form and no function. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, thank you to Dr. Tan. I'm not sure if I'm entering chairperson's nightmare territory where I can't find my next speaker. Oh, he's here. Phew. He's been hiding. It's with great pleasure that we welcome Mr. Geoffrey Bruce. He's the principal of JBC, a national landscape architectural firm founded in 1986. JBC provide highly specialised technical support to many of the nation's leading architectural and landscape architectural firms. Please welcome Geoffrey.
I was a little intimidated. I come from the shortgrass prairie. I have to follow the Singapore presentation on green. I think that's not quite fair. I'm not sure I have enough green markers in my entire office to compensate for that. I'm going to try something a little different and a little unusual, which is seldom do I talk about my own work when I'm lecturing and talking, and I was asked to sort of put that together, so I'm trying to find a narrative or a theme that would have resonance and sort of meaning here. And I thought there was two aspects of our practice that would be meaningful to share and discuss. One being relationship with water in most of our projects and our attempt to create a balance with water and how we do that on roofs. And the second is that even after 35 years or more of practice, it's still not easy. You have failures, you have challenges in the process, and I'm one of those crazy sort of guys that will show you what those are and sort of explain the methodology behind it. So hopefully if we can prevent anyone here from falling in the same pit that I have throughout my career, I think it would be considered beneficial. So with that, our idea of water has been pretty sophisticated. So what I thought I'd do is open up with this fairly elaborate premise that usually gets me to these types of talks, which is sort of this. It's a model that covers everything we do, and most of the public perception of water is such. So it rains somewhere, and you open a tap and you get water, and it's pretty magical at that point. So I always enjoy Edward Abbey, which said, water is not a shortage in the desert until you try to build a city there. So there's a natural relationship with water and nature that we're imposing on and disrupting. So I think it's important to really understand the water cycles, where you're at, and how to address those. So really the rise of living architecture, I think, is a wonderful point in time to begin. I've never given this presentation before, so I have no idea what I'm going to say or the rhythm. I have no rhythm to this. But we started in 1981 working on what was then considered rooftop gardens. And it just fascinated me, trying to adapt an organic living form to a very rigid engineering structure and the challenges behind that sort of endeavor. This particular project was pretty unique because it was a parking garage that sloped down a couple stories. And on one side of the site, I had a planter box that was 37 feet deep. And on the other side of the building, I had a planter box that was 6 inches deep. So it created its own little challenges and uniqueness. Probably one of the more interesting ones that we started was the renovation of Soldier Field in Chicago. The old 1932 Olympic Stadium had sort of required a renovation, and they really looked at greening the entire facade, the peristyle, and most of the parking lots that surrounded it. The plan was to create about an additional 12 to 15 acres of green space in the heart of downtown Chicago, and about 5 acres of that was on deck on top of a parking garage. The parking garage, does this work? Yep. So the parking garage is here, and it was about 2,500 cars. The problem was they wanted to create a promenade between the Science Museum and the stadium itself, but there was 90-foot grade elevation. So we had to build up grade on that deck, which included about 35 feet of foam concrete and about 35 feet of expanded foam. That would get us up to the elevation that we could create sort of a seamless park between the two of them. It was one of the first opportunities we had to really look at water movement and water sensing, so we disposed of ET, or evapotranspiration, as a control model for soil moisture, and we installed volumetric meters throughout the soil so we would get direct reading instead of inferred readings of soil moisture, so that we could be a little more exacting in how we controlled those types of systems. And we were able to really understand and look at how water pulsed through the soil profiles and how saturated flow would work in some of these. So it really gave us some insight that we could build on in the future in terms of that. Here you can see they're finished with the foam concrete, and we've got are starting to put on the 5 acres of expanded foam, which was sort of interesting. Every week we would get a photo, construction photo, showing that the progress, and you'd look at it, and I got the one from April and it looked fine, and I got the one from May and it didn't look so fine. It looked like it was an older photo, so I looked at it real closely and realized that most all of the foam had disappeared off the deck. And come to find out, they had a sheer wind rip through Chicago Sunday night at about 75 miles an hour, and it picked up 5 acres of foam and took it into the lake. So it was. And the thing I found about foam that is, I think these were 4 by 4 by about 30 feet, big blocks. As they cartwheel across the landscape, they tend to chew themselves up pretty good and are no longer serviceable for bulking any longer. So the lesson learned out of this was really basically we've got one heck of a ballasting requirement during construction now, that you need to secure this stuff to protect it. It was quite fortunate that it happened Sunday night and there was no one on site, but it was one of those situations you sort of wake up in cold sweat. We had one-to-one slopes on this, and we had a very elaborate system of looking at reinforcement of soils and sort of working with the nature of the soils, and had a very good solution that had never been sort of constructed before. And we go out on site, and we had a very high bulk density on the soil so that it would be stabilized in place. We had 95% proctor on those soils, and there were 2 guys standing out there with shovels hitting that soil as it went down, and it's like, we're not going to get 95%. Oh, it'll be fine. So they had a pretty severe rain event, and we did the testing right before this, and they were about 35% proctor, so it was still pretty fluffy. And that rain event supersaturated and liquefied the entire slope and sort of took it out and took it to the ground, which, you know, it's funny when you have sort of these construction issues come along, all of a sudden you get a couple hundred emails in the matter of an hour or two, and a lot of curiosity and stuff that you'd never hear about otherwise. But so this one, we had the solution, and it was proven that we couldn't identify another locale where it would have been done before, even though we had specified a methodology that was rational. What we wanted them to do in the pre-construction was to build up a cofferdam system, compact it on the way up, build a cofferdam, and then take it out and plant it on the way down. So the initial contractor that was selected for this was over $1 million cheaper than the next lowest bid. So they had indicated that we tried to consider them as non-responsive, and they said we can fix a lot of problems for $1 million, so here we go. So what was interesting was at that point, as a landscape architect, I was no longer relevant in the solution of the project. So they brought an engineering firm out to engineer the slope solution, the cellular system. And you can see their solution, which seemed more than adequate, with the exception that their system failed. So we got engineering team A that got sent to the bench with us as they brought in engineering team B to re-engineer the slope again. And all I can tell you is that if you're worried about a nuclear strike anywhere in the Chicago area, I'd go under that roof and you'd probably be protected based on what we saw. They replaced the system and really reinforced it. So the lesson that came really out of this one is that it is difficult in a competitive bid environment and a public bid environment on getting qualified people on a low bid situation where they're unwilling to reject unresponsive bids. And they left $1 million on the table. And basically, I think when it was all said and done, that particular contractor cost them about $3.5 million along the project. So it wasn't that hard to spend the $1 million to catch up. So when you look at this, you know, it's pretty easy to tell who's going to get the contract. It's the guy that didn't go out and buy all the really expensive equipment that will prevent him from actually dying on that site, probably. So, lesson one. Overall, it turned out to be a very lovely project, given the year or two. You can see the slope once planted and once stabilized. This is the children's garden on the edge of it. And basically everything above the walk there is on deck, and it's used for events, a couple thousand people per year. Another fascinating project was the Gates Foundation project, which was just completed a couple of years ago. It is a pretty fully site integrated water system. We're collecting water from all of the surfaces, the roof, the permeable pavements, all the hard surfaces, and it's supplying 100% of the irrigation. It's supplying 100% of the water feature, and it is also supplying the vast majority of non-potable interior water. So it's a pretty integrated system in regards to that. It's got some significant engineering to move all that water around. The cistern in the bottom of the building was, I think, about 800, 900,000 gallons. And it zeroed out pretty well. You can see some of the construction here, sort of as it progresses, some of the distribution piping to move water around. It was about a 6-acre site, I believe, all on deck. That's the sort of the polishing marsh area that would become one of the water features. So the water feature was also utilized to polish the water and cycle through the cistern. So the other lesson I think that's important from this type of project is just because you have designed it within budget, got it agreed in budget, bid it and got it on budget, and it's going along, doesn't mean it's not going to be taken out of the project. There's this constant tug of resources throughout the project that always tends to put the landscape in jeopardy. You know, it seems to be always expendable in terms of its requirements. So I think you always have to advocate continuously to ensure that it's going to be built, because you know, we've had lots of projects that you get all the way to the end of the project and they're running short, and it's landscape. And in 35 years, 40 years, we'll put it in later. I've never seen anyone put it in later. So that's beyond my sort of timeline in terms of what they can do. Some examples of the project. We work primarily as a consultant to the designers. Chicago Field was Peter Shout's office out of Chicago. The Gates Foundation is GGN out of Seattle. Very creative designers. And it really turned out, this was interesting, toward the middle of the project, we found out that we were $500 million over budget. You know, and it's like, oh, what does that mean? You know, those types of meetings, I don't know how to respond to that. Well, I can give you a couple hundred for this tree. So another really fascinating project we just finished, been growing for about a year, was Noah's Fisheries in La Jolla. And it was the most incredible client you would ever want for. 275 researchers that research the environment and follow migratory patterns of fish. And, you know, so every time you thought you were pushing sort of the edge, they would challenge you and have you do something even more creative. The structure was very large, and it was an extremely difficult site. They had about 300,000 square foot of program on a site that sloped 120 feet. So again, someone else will need to make the conversions for me. But it was created in such a way that it was tucked into the facility, and it was one of the very few remaining native areas within La Jolla. It had been disturbed, but it was still had some interesting ecology and ecotones in there. So part of our solution was to go out within the dune community and harvest endangered seed. And we did a mock-up. It was about a 1.5-year mock-up where we would test the different seed varieties to get an appropriate mix for the system. Again, because of the sandy nature of the beach environment, we were able to achieve a total zero runoff stormwater site. Between the harvest, and the nature of the site, regardless of the event, we wouldn't have any further water running off. And that was an important issue, being as close as we were to La Jolla and the La Jolla Trench. So narrow profile, 6-inch profile. The soil systems were unique because of the rain patterns and the sodic nature of the soil. We actually had to incorporate baking soda and create a soil that was a little bit caustic so that it would match the native plants. This is right after planting. Again, a lovely place to work. Beautiful building. The architects on this was Gould Evans out of Kansas City. But the thing you learn is that we deal in a different science than construction does for the most part. We deal in agronomy, and they deal in engineering. And agronomy and engineering are two separate and distinct sciences, right? Our sieving is different. We use wet sieving, they use dry sieving. Our measurements for compaction are different. So what you find is that it's very, very difficult, if not impossible, to achieve agronomic performance by only using engineering methods. So everything out on site is measured typically in engineering methodology. So it's the idea of starting to incorporate agronomic testing as a methodology to ensure that you're going to get the right solution out of that. Another project that was completed this past year, Moshe Safdie building. We worked with Reed Hildebrand out of Boston on this, and Performing Arts Center, which is about 5 acres on deck for the new Performing Arts building in Kansas City. What was interesting there was stormwater, and we had to sort of fight the city in terms of the stormwater detention facility, which was going to cost about $500,000 to put a big lovely hole on the side of the site so when it rained it would fill up and drain off. So we took our green roof into the lab and we began to model its performance. And we sort of took it to field capacity and looked at the worst case scenario, saying that if this was at field capacity and it rained, what sort of impact would we have on the 100-year flood? And if we could demonstrate a positive impact, maybe we can take it to the city and talk to them. So we set it up this way. We did 3 1-inch 20-minute rain events, or 3 inches over an hour, which was getting close to our 100-year frequency. And then we measured accumulated discharge. And what we found was that in a saturated soil, in a field capacity soil, we held half of the 100-year storm for 12 hours, and we held a quarter of it for 90 hours. So the pre-development stormwater was calculated at about 65 cubic feet per second. The city wanted to achieve pre-development hydrology, which was about 35 feet per second. And when we use this number in the engineer's model, we were down to 5 feet per second. So we were 7-fold under the city guidelines. So what was interesting, we looked primarily at water within the soil profile in the different phases. Hydroscopic water is bound up. It doesn't mean anything to the plants or to stormwater. The micropore volume or capillary moisture is where all the plants, that's sort of matrix potential there. But you look at the large volume of pore space, and that's really storage. And you can fill that up, and it's sort of a tortuous path that takes time for it to empty. So we were able to model the cisterns, look at water see how much we could take out of that. This is the water diagram for the site itself. And we got the city talked into approving us as a stormwater detention facility on the roof, which allowed us to free up the $500,000 of stormwater detention. And we were able to put in 100,000 gallons of cisterns so that we could take more water totally out of the system. Those always surprised me. You know, you're drawing them on your desk, and you do all your calcs, and the piece of paper's about this big, and then they pull them up on site on a big semi, and it's like, whoa. I'm going to go check my calcs. So, Moshe Safdie building, a spectacular building. Unfortunately, the architect wanted a bit of a monoculture there in order to highlight the architecture. We had a big performance lawn out front that we had to fight to keep. And I just, you build a $400 million performance art center, and you're going to put a parking lot out in front of it. No front yard to this building. Sort of scary. But we had to justify this a number of times. Whenever you walk into a construction meeting, and the rest of the people in the room look like this, you know it's going to be a tough meeting, right? We got pulled into arbitration because during construction, we had everything, all the bulk foam down. We were getting ready to place soil, and soil hadn't been gotten placed yet. And we got a 6-inch rain event that came down off the roof, jumped the lifts and elevators, and flooded all the mechanical systems in the bottom layer. And it was like, you guys got a bad design there. And it's like, no, we don't. We have 6 inches of soil which would buffer runoff. You know, it's a case that the site wasn't protected during construction, and the runoff on foam is much different than the runoff on soil. So communication and sort of conveying this to the team members is really one of those fundamental things that you constantly have to cross-train and sort of work with the team to understand what those implications are. But that isn't the first group that you walk in and looks like that. So this was last week, as I'm preparing out of town. Fabulous project, Kansas State Purple Mass Theater. It's the old football stadium for Kansas State Wildcats. It was decommissioned in the 70s. It's a rec facility. And the structure was getting tentative enough that they couldn't put mass crowds out there. So we had a solution to cover it with a green roof and leave a small portion for seating. Fairly spectacular. It was we were emulating the Kanza Prairie in terms of the plant matrix, and the Kansas State Purple Wildcats was prominent in the color system. So things are coming along. We've got our cellular confinement system. We're starting to load it with soil, 6-inch profile, and the whole thing slides off the structure. It's my project manager. We were there when he opened the email, took a look at it, and all you could see him do is, and it's like, we've been through this before. Knowing we've been through this before, we worked the numbers and reworked them, and we had the right solution. But in the design build calculation for the confinement system, they transpose their numbers. So our loading was 62.5 pounds per square foot saturated weight. And they ran their system with 62 pounds per cubic foot and doubled the tension. So it immediately got us concerned on a structure that was built in 1926 that could only hold 6 inches, that we now had areas of soil that were starting to approach 30 inches. And there was no way to really do that other than to take shovels and buckets and clean that off the roof, which has taken about 3 weeks. So we're in the process of re-engineering. Once again, we're sort of sitting back, and the engineer A, who we hope will successfully navigate us through this, we're looking at a different tendon cabling system for this. But I think the point is that, you can do everything you can do and be right in the solution, and there's problems sort of growing up in the process that will trip you up. And this was a miscommunication between the subs on the project. We had a protected membrane system. The structure was so deteriorated we couldn't get adherent of the hot asphalt. So we had to convert everything to a conventional roof system. And we had 2 layers of protecting board, and they didn't submit that back to the manufacturer to get the right friction factor. So besides the transposed numbers and the wrong friction factor, we were fortunate enough that it failed before they got much further. But it tends to work out. And you understand when you're looking at this, it's a fragmented system. You're having people design multiple layers at this, and none of them may have a complete understanding that you have on how these interwork and interrelate. So I think it's important to look at those. Last one I'll talk about is Navy Pier, which is sort of in construction now. This is a field operations project. Sort of the high line on the water. Pretty interesting project. There was no greenery out there to start with. And what's interesting in this is that pier stretches a half a mile out into the lake. And we did a lot of integrated water in terms of that. It stretches a half a mile out into the lake, and we have to drain. They put in pots for the big trees. So they cut into the structure, dropped in pots that sit only a couple inches above water level. Can anyone figure out what the real problem is? We can't drain into the lake. So we have to take a pipe a half a mile onshore with no slope. So we made up a concept which was tidal pulsing. We'll see how that works. But we created a sort of a tidal pulse and created the hydraulic conductivity that one day that water will make it out. They are maples, so I think we're tolerant of a little bit of inundation now and then. But there's challenges in all this. This is phase 1 just being completed. But I think what is important, what I wanted to really share with you is when you get into groups like this, there's a common understanding and a common goal and direction about what we're trying to achieve. But so often is the case in these meetings, I'm the only guy beating the table, saying we can do this and demanding that we do this. And it's at risk because some of these, there's a certain degree of sadism in the fact that, yeah, I told you that we didn't want to do this, right? But until all of us take that courage and stand up and beat the table and be advocates for this, the amount of inertia will stop these projects. And it takes some guts, and it takes some stamina, and it takes putting your reputation out there and living through some challenges in terms of that. But it's the right thing to do. And it's the only thing to do. And it's what we're here to do. So I hope none of you will have photos like this, but you will, because we are on the edge of the stick. We are part of the tip of the sword, and we're learning and challenged every day to create these solutions, custom solutions. And we're going to have failures, and we're going to learn from them, and we're going to get better. So that's what I wanted to share with you.
Well, we've been spoilt with two very informative speeches. I'll just take the microphone over here, and if there's anyone got any questions, send them up this way.
Sure.
What am I doing in this profession?
Is someone running around with a microphone?
I think it's going to be me by the look of it. There we go. We'll start here because he's close.
G'day. I have a question for Jeffrey. In the US, how much involvement do the landscape architects have in that tendering sort of process? Like, there's obviously some examples there where people have been selected for the job that may or may not have put in a full bid, or a bid that was apples with apples. So how much of a opportunity do you have to respond to that in the US?
Usually you have a really good opportunity to, during the process, talk to the owner about qualifications and trying to explain the technical nature of what you're doing. But there's situations as the project gets larger, the process tends to get out of control a little bit. I have no idea, on Navy Pier, we had 100% construction drawings and we had 100% specs. And they bid it with our 100% drawings and 50% DD specs. And it just created 5 weeks of trying to negotiate what the scope was because they didn't bid the right. But I think for the most part you can manage that and express it. You have to build in the protective values within your specifications, and we won't take a project unless we're out on site watching it go in. If you're not going to hire us to superintend it, writing a spec is the easy part. Actually building it is the hard part. So if you're not going to do that, then we're going to take that as a pretty large red flag and walk away from the project.
Any other questions at all? Here and here.
Dr. Tan, I visited Singapore last year and was just thrilled at the amount of greenery that's growing everywhere when you look out your hotel room. Is there anywhere that on the internet where you can actually find a list of projects to go and look at once you're in Singapore? I found it difficult to ask people to say, I just want to go and see some green roofs or some green walls and some good new developments, and other than going on a bus tour right around the city, which was fantastic. Is there anywhere that you can look at these things?
Yeah, no, in fact, there is a portal that has been set up by National Parks Board, and in fact, my former colleague, Faisal, I'm not sure whether she's here, she shared that yesterday, she's at the back. And if you go onto the National Parks Board website, you'll find a link to a portal that lists the projects with high-rise greenery installations in Singapore. In fact, there's also a map to show you where they are, right? So that is here.
As well as roofs being very useful for green infrastructure, they can also be very useful for water catching and also for solar energy, for panels. Is there some way that these three sustainable investments can be compatible in some way?
Yeah. Is that, should I answer that question?
Yeah, either of you, both of you.
Okay, I'll give my take first here. No, it has been said that the city is actually a space where there's a perpetual contest for space. So now, not only are we competing for space at the ground level in Singapore, we're competing for rooftop space, simply because Singapore has been pushing very hard now also to move into PV panels as a form of renewable energy to be deployed in Singapore. Right, so on the roof, we do now get situations where a developer will want to put in the PV panels, and a landscape architect would say that, no way, I'm going to put my green roof. Right? But to me, they are compatible. In fact, we followed on research that has been started, I guess, in Germany, and later on done by several groups in USA, for instance, by David Saylor. I think one of his work was mentioned in the earlier presentation, where we find that if you put a green roof and a PV panel together, there's some increase in efficiency of the PV panel, simply because the green roof has reduced the surface temperature. And in Singapore, where it's very hot, the efficiency reduces when the temperature goes up too high. Right? So there are compatibility. And I think in regards to integrating the green with the blue element, I certainly think there's a case for it. We do not have enough data in Singapore to demonstrate the true effectiveness of green roofs. I'm talking about very shallow, perhaps 100 millimeters to 200 millimeters green roof, in the efficiency of reducing, for instance, peak discharge, simply because we get a lot of rain in Singapore in over a short period of time, and the roof gets saturated really quickly. So you don't get the kind of retention ability over a long period of time. That's our suspicion, but we have not done enough work really in Singapore's climate to really demonstrate whether it's true or not true. But I would also like to add that the ability of the green roof to perhaps mediate or try to remediate some of the stormwater discharge, I think that should have potential, and we should maximize the ability to do this through integration. Yeah.
This is to Dr. Tan and Geoffrey. So Geoffrey, basically for a large podium gardens and the landscape you people are involved, what's the slab load considerations you people do on the soil type? This has been a very frequent question for us when we are doing the job, that what is the load and what is the soil? So what is the general adoption that you have done it?
From our standpoint, typically if we're looking at large trees, our profile will be about a meter and a quarter. And grass and turf will be down to about a foot, 12 inches, as small as 6 inches. So the loading rates we're looking at are anywhere from 100 pounds dead load to about 350 pounds dead load. And most of these are on concrete substrates. And we're pretty much point loading most of the large trees over columns.
I do not have the exact figures on the loading, but for trees on the rooftop garden, typically we will specify 1 to 1.5 meter soil depth. For shrubs, it's up to 60 cm, and for ground cover, it's up to 30 cm. For green roofs, typically, we were looking at perhaps a loading of not more than 2 kilonewtons per square meters. Yeah.
This to Sir Geoffrey, but if you do it on a point load like column, are you not dictating the design to the engineering limitations? Like what if we demand that, like for example, I've been doing it in India. I totally disagree with the point load design system. No, but it looks too plastic. This is the war that I always conduct with the structural engineers and the clients. So seldom we win. Yeah.
It's a compromise, so we can influence it sometimes early on. You know, our early estimates are about $2 a square foot for structural loading when you're looking at some of the point loading. So it isn't very excessive early in the process. So you do have flexibility. Some projects try to incorporate that. Millennium Park, they really didn't know what they were going to put above there. So all 26 acres is 4 feet deep. So they can move whatever they want in the future. That's sort of the opposite side of the spectrum. But you know, you're balancing structure and weight and performance against budget. And a lot of times budgets are established that aren't very luxurious in terms of that, and you're fighting to push it. We tend to try to work with the soft spots where you can get a little movement, and if not, then the design sort of responds to that.
All right, on that note, thank you very much, and if you could please thank Dr. Tan and Geoffrey Bruce.